Topic 3. The Conflict Navigator, Part 1. The Cost of Silence. In the global arena, conflict is inevitable. But for many, English becomes a barrier when the temperature rises. When a deadline is missed, a contract is breached, or a colleague oversteps, do you stay silent because you lack the fighting words? Or do you explode, letting your frustration turn your English into a weapon that burns bridges? Today, we follow Elena, a brilliant consultant who realized that in high-stakes global business, being nice is often the most expensive mistake you can make. It's time to move from polite English to assertive power. Elena was a senior strategy consultant based in Madrid, working for a top-tier global firm. Her English was fluent, elegant, and, above all, kind. Elena had been raised with the belief that professionalism was synonymous with politeness. She was the peacekeeper of the office. She hated tension, feared making a scene, and prided herself on being the person who could always find a compromise. But in the world of high-stakes international negotiations, Elena's kindness was being mistaken for weakness. The problem came to a head during a multi-million-dollar contract negotiation with a powerhouse tech firm from New York. Elena was lead on the terms and conditions phase. Her counterpart was a man named Miller, a low-context, high-aggression negotiator who treated every conversation like a street fight. During the negotiation calls, Miller would constantly interrupt Elena. He would dismiss her data with phrases like, "That's not how we do things here," or "You're overthinking the risks." Elena, wanting to be professional, would wait for him to finish. She would start her responses with, "I'm sorry, but," or "I understand your point. However." By the end of the second week, Miller had pushed Elena into a corner. He had stripped away her firm's liability protections and squeezed their margins to the bone. Elena knew the terms were dangerous for her company, but she couldn't find the assertive words in English to stop him. Every time she tried to push back, her voice would go slightly higher, her grammar would stumble, and she would eventually retreat into a frustrated silence. That Friday, her managing director called her. "Elena," he said, his voice grave, "you are letting him walk all over us. I know you want to be polite, but Miller doesn't value politeness. He values strength. If you can't defend our position, I'll have to replace you on this deal. You're not a conflict navigator right now. You're a passenger." Elena sat in a quiet cafe in Madrid, her face burning with shame. She realized that her polite English was actually a form of linguistic submission. Because she didn't know how to disagree with precision, she was defaulting to safe English. She realized that conflict isn't something to be avoided. It is a tool to be navigated. She looked at her notes from the week. They were full of soft phrases and apologies. She realized that Miller wasn't the problem. Her conflict blueprint was. She had mastered the language of cooperation, but she was a total beginner in the language of assertive conflict. If she didn't find her fighting voice by Monday, she wouldn't just lose the deal. She would lose her seat at the table. Elena decided right then that the nice girl was going on vacation. She needed to learn how to say no in a way that commanded respect, not an apology. If you've ever found yourself nodding yes in an English meeting when your brain was screaming no, you are not alone. Hit that like button and subscribe to the English Oasis. We're about to follow Elena as she learns the specific power phrases and psychological triggers to win any argument. Part 2. The Assertive Toolkit. Elena spent the weekend debugging her own communication style. She realized that Miller's aggression wasn't a sign of superior logic. It was a tactic designed to trigger her polite reflex. To break the cycle, she needed to replace her emotional reactions with systemic assertiveness. She began to build what she called her conflict toolkit. The first tool she mastered was the neutral interruption. Elena had a habit of waiting for a polite gap to speak, but she realized that aggressive negotiators never leave gaps. Elena practiced a firm, low-pitched phrase to cut through the noise. "Miller, let me stop you there so we can address that specific point." She didn't say sorry, and she didn't ask for permission. She simply stated a fact. The second tool was the mirror and label. Elena learned that when Miller made an aggressive demand, she didn't have to defend her position immediately. Defense is a weak position. Instead, she could mirror his words to force him to explain himself. If Miller said, "Your liability terms are ridiculous," Elena wouldn't explain why they were fair. She would simply repeat the key word with a questioning tone. "Ridiculous?" This forced Miller to fill the silence. When he did, Elena would label the underlying emotion. "It seems like you're concerned about the speed of implementation." This moved the conflict from the heart to the head. But the most powerful tool in her kit was the positive no. Elena realized that her previous no sounded like a rejection, which triggered Miller's combativeness. A positive no is structured as a sandwich. Yes, value. No, boundary. Yes, alternative. She practiced her lines for Monday morning. "We are committed to making this partnership work. However, we cannot accept the current liability cap because it puts our firm at unnecessary risk. What we can do is increase the insurance." By framing the no between two yeses, she wasn't being difficult. She was being a problem solver with boundaries. Monday morning arrived. Elena sat in her office, her notes in front of her. She didn't feel nice, but she felt solid. When the Zoom call started, Miller immediately went on the attack. "Elena, I looked at your revisions. They're a joke. We're losing time here." In the past, Elena would have flinched. She would have said, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but we have rules." This time, Elena didn't flinch. She used her neutral interruption. "Miller, I'm going to stop you there. A joke isn't a professional assessment. Let's look at the specific clause on page 4. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of Elena's retreat. It was the silence of Miller's surprise. He had hit the wall, and the wall didn't move. Elena felt a surge of quiet power. She had realized that in English, You don't need to be loud to be heard. You just need to be immovable. Part 3. The win-win pivot. Elena had successfully neutralized Miller's initial aggression. The invisible wall of her politeness had been replaced by a shield of assertiveness. But as the meeting progressed, Elena realized that simply defending wasn't enough. If she stayed in defensive mode, the negotiation would end in a stalemate. She realized that a true conflict navigator doesn't just stop the fight. They redirect the energy. She needed to move from counterpunching to problem-solving. This required a psychological shift called the win-win pivot. The first step was a technique called tactical empathy. She looked at Miller, who was now looking frustrated. Instead of attacking his ego, she decided to acknowledge his pressure. Miller, it sounds like you have a very tight deadline from your board, and any liability discussion feels like a delay to you. Is that a fair assessment? Miller paused. He wasn't used to his enemy acknowledging his stress. Yeah, he grunted. The board wants this signed by Friday, or the rollout is in jeopardy. Elena had found the black swan, the hidden piece of information. Miller wasn't just being a bully. He was terrified of his own board. By using English to uncover the why behind the what, Elena had changed the dynamic from a battle of wills to a shared race against time. She then used the collaborative frame. Instead of me versus you, she started using we versus the problem. She began to structure her sentences using conditional proposals. Miller, if we can find a way to accelerate the insurance sign-off by Wednesday, then would you be open to keeping our original liability cap in place? By phrasing it as a question, she invited Miller to be the hero who solves the problem. She was using her English to give him a gold bridge to retreat across. The final piece was the commitment check. Elena knew that in high-stress negotiations, people often say yes, just to end the tension, only to back out later. To prevent this, she asked, how will we know if this insurance bridge is working for both teams? And what happens if the board rejects the Wednesday deadline? By asking how and what questions, she forced Miller to think about implementation. She was using English to build a contract that was stress-tested. By the end of the call, the atmosphere had transformed. Miller was no longer interrupting her. He was listening. They were two experts speaking a shared language. Elena realized that conflict was the raw material of a better solution. You don't win by being the loudest. You win by holding the most context without breaking. Part 4. The seat at the table. The final negotiation session took place on a rainy Monday afternoon. The stakes couldn't have been higher. It was the sign or walk deadline. In the past, this kind of pressure would have made Elena's voice shake. She would have been tempted to give away one last concession just to keep the peace. But as she adjusted her headset, she felt a strange, cool sense of detachment. She wasn't the peacekeeper anymore. She was the navigator. Miller opened with one last power play. Elena, I've got the board on the other line. They're not happy. we need a 5% discount. Take it or leave it. This time, she used a tactical pause. She let the silence sit for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to make the air feel heavy. "Miller," she said, her voice dropping into a calm register. "A discount would mean we'd have to reduce the quality of the technical support team. That's a trade-off I'm not willing to make for your project's success. Let's look at the early completion bonus instead. If we hit milestones early, you get your savings." She didn't use "I'm sorry." She didn't use "I think." She spoke in declarative sentences. She had mastered the linguistic pivot, turning his demand into an incentive. Miller stared at the screen. He looked at his notes, then back at Elena. For the first time, he gave a short, genuine nod. Fine. The bonus structure works. When the call ended, Elena didn't just feel relieved. She felt transformed. She had successfully defended her firm's interests and earned the deep respect of her counterpart. Her managing director called her an hour later. "Elena, that was a masterclass. You've earned your seat at the table for the London merger next month." Elena realized then that assertive English wasn't about being mean. It was about identity. She was no longer a student. She was a master of the outcome. Being a conflict navigator means having the courage to be uncomfortable, the skill to be precise, and the wisdom to know that a bridge built on a fake yes will collapse. She walked out into the Madrid rain, no longer the nice girl who stayed silent, but a global leader who knew exactly how to speak her truth. Elena's story reminds us that silence has a price. You don't need to change your personality to be assertive. You just need to change your toolkit. The next time you feel the urge to say, "I'm sorry, but..." in a meeting, stop. Replace it with "my perspective is." Or, let's look at the data. Notice how the power dynamic shifts when you remove the apology. Join the conversation. What is your conflict style? Are you a peacekeeper or a steamroller? If you're ready to stand your ground, make sure to subscribe to the English Oasis. We're building a community of leaders who aren't afraid of the hard conversations. Hit the like button if Elena's transformation inspired you. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we meet Marcus, who will show us how to build global influence.